Remove him from the ledgers, Mereth, and shoved a damp slip of paper under the corridor lamp while No. 47 pressed his forehead to the iron grill and watched hands decide his fate. Fear made his fingers tremble against the rusted bars. He counted breaths aloud and tried to keep the count steady. The registrar, Lucian Merrick, lifted the slip with 2 careful fingers and read it as if reading a grocery list. The corridor smelled of cold stone and candle tallow. In those 5 steps, the exchange of paper, the scrape of a boot, the tilt of a lamp, the problem declared itself. His name would be abolished on paper, and without paper the state would deny he ever existed. He had been given the number No. 47 weeks earlier. The number fit across a ledger column and across a roster of disappeared men. No. 47 had learned to make himself small in the cell, to breathe without attracting attention, to move only when necessary. He matched his survival to routine. The opening moment forced a shift in him. First suspicion when he saw the slip moved, then fear as Mereth's voice hardened, then the thin impulse to act. That movement, suspicion to fear to a brittle plan, shaped his first choice. He could not stop them openly. He would try to leave proof. They argued in measured tones, 3 paces from the bars. Lucian, Mereth, this must look clean. The order came from above. Lucian adjusted his spectacles and replied, orders require paperwork. The paper must reflect it. No. 47 mouthed a silent question at the iron. He did not have words to ask for mercy. He had the scrap folded into the sleeve under his patched shirt. A faint smudge of ink, a name scrawled by hand, a date written in his scratchy hand, when he still hoped someone would record him. He had sewn that scrap into the seam with a single thread. They moved him later, after the exchange, along the damp corridor into the archive room where ledgers stood like flat, backed witnesses. Lucian carried a satchel of bound records and set them on a table with ritual precision. The archives smelled of old glue, pressed vellum, and iron polish. Lucian's fingers smoothed a page and tapped his brass seal twice on the wooden desk before opening. Mereth stood with his coat still damp from the corridor and kept a hand on the ring of heavy keys at his belt. The ritual was mechanical. Lucian arranged ledgers by date. He laid the slip beside a handwritten column and read aloud the entry that identified No. 47, prisoner 47. Transfer to administrative void. Mereth repeated the phrase, voice low and exact. No. 47 heard the words like a hammer. The catalogue language existed to hide the fact of a person. He shifted from fear to a simmering defiance. He pressed his tongue to the roof of his mouth and listened to the scrape of the quill in Lucian's hand. That scrape led to their first confrontation, not in the archive, but at the narrow interrogation cell where Mereth had dragged him. The cell smelled of stone warmed against the sunless side of the building, and the brazier that never fully went out. Mereth leaned close to No. 47 and asked the same questions as the ledger. Name, origin, associates. No. 47 answered with short sentences. His voice was hoarse, but he pronounced dates and places clearly, hoping that a spoken record might outlast a struck line. Tell me who you spoke to on the 3rd of April, Mereth names. Now Mereth's tone was patient. His hand rested on the metal strap of a wrist restraint. No. 47 named 3 people, each syllable brief. Lucian will mark it. Mereth, Lucian will know what to keep and what to burn. No. 47 tried to watch Lucian through the grill, but Lucian was not there yet. Mereth catalogued No. 47's answers into a small metal notebook with a practiced script. The notebook had no labels on its cover. When No. 47 offered the faint ink, smudged scrap, sliding it into his sleeve in one fluid, silent movement, Mereth did not notice until later. That slip became a thread he would tug at dangerously. Back in the archive, Lucian handled the ledgers like sacred tools of the institution. He examined marginalia and small scratch notes written in other hands. His spectacles caught the candlelight. A faint corner of a page showed an old registry with a rubbed name, an attempt at overwriting now visible as paler ink beneath newer strokes. Lucian paused. For the first time that night he showed an internal startle. He brought a careful fingertip to the margin and read the ghost of another line beneath the newer ink. Nothing. Mereth answered the break in silence with a low affirmation. It is ordered from above, he said. We do not decide here. Their voices formed a short argument, then settled into coordination. Lucian's hand trembled when he set the brass seal down, then steadied. He chose a blank page and prepared his bone-handled stamp. Merrick, Lucian, if I alter the page, you will seal the cell and lock the keys. Mareth tapped his keyring once and replied, "I will." Clean slip, clean ledger, close as this. The exchange included 3 quick replies and no raised voices, no. 47 listened to the recording of bureaucracy and realized the danger required a quieter countermove. When brought back to the cell, no. 47 performed a small theft of time. He maneuvered his sleeve so the scrap slid toward his palm. Mareth saw the motion and stepped forward, but the guard was not fast enough. No. 47 slipped the scrap into a hidden fold under the straw of his bunk. He had practiced this motion once, twice, and now it came with automatic precision. That act, concealing paper inside the cell, shifted his emotion from panic to a quiet hope. He had introduced a physical token that, if preserved, might speak his name after the ledgers were altered. Mareth did not leave him alone for long. The interrogator returned with a measured knock and a question on his lips. He leaned into no. 47's face close enough to count the scars. "Who put that into your sleeve?" Mareth, watching his eyes. No. 47 swallowed and kept his reply tight. He refused to point fingers. The refusal cost him a harder hold on the arms. Mareth's hands were thick. They gripped with professional restraint. They dragged him back through the corridor to the archive while Lucian closed the satchel and opened a brazier in the corner of the archive room. At the brazier, Lucian prepared the staged erasure. He chose the page that would be altered. He read the ink and then pressed the seal into the warmed wax. The room contracted. Lucian's voice was flat when he recited the order for record alteration. Mareth's response was a single line. "Do what you must." "No." 47 stood with his hands bound and watched Lucian slide toward him with a small pair of forceps. Lucian opened the scrap with a thumb and first finger and read the name aloud in a whisper. The climax arrived inside the cell. Lucian slithered inside under a pretense of inspection while Mareth restrained no. 47. Mareth's grip was clinical. He did not shout. Lucian did not hurry. He reached into the shirt sleeve, found the folded scrap, and pried it free. No. 47 tried to retract the motion, to keep his scrap on his person. He kicked once, a short, raw motion. Mareth tightened his hold and hissed. "Not now." Lucian unfolded the scrap and flattened it on the brazier edge. He read the ink as if verifying a label, then took a tinder stick and dropped flames until the paper curled. The physical struggle lasted seconds, but felt longer. No. 47 twisted and spat a short oath. Mareth counted knuckles on the cell bench as he shifted grip. Lucian bent over the flicker and watched the paper scorch. The scrap blackened, a smell of burned glue and ink punching the air. No. 47 lunged toward the brazier, hand out, fingers burning as he tried to snatch the fragment. Mareth shoved him back. Heat licked his knuckles. Lucian dropped the charred remains into the brazier and watched the ash fall. The voices in the corridor were quiet. The only sound was the small, sharp cry that no. 47 could not hold back when flame took the last of his handwriting. After the struggle, Lucian returned to the archive and closed the ledger with a flat, practiced motion. He placed a blank page over the place where the name had been and stamped it with the brass seal. The seal left a jagged impression. Lucian tapped it twice, slow and deliberate. Mareth fastened the cell door and clicked the keys into place. He walked the ring of keys inside his palm as if confirming each tooth. A ledger adjusted. Lucian answered. Record complete. The 2 words were final. No. 47 sat on the bunk and counted breaths as his hand shook. Left alone, no. 47 turned to the stone bunk. He produced a splintered bit of wood, the one he had saved from a crate weeks earlier. He pressed it to the stone and carved a notch, tiny and nearly invisible. He carved the date and the initials of the name that had been burned. 3 letters, cramped and shallow. The act left splinters under his nails. His breathing changed from ragged to measured. The carving was a physical trace he could hide in plain sight. He had moved from hope to bitter, quiet defiance. The physical work of carving was his language now. It was a deliberate choice to leave a mark where paper could be consumed. Across the corridor, Lucian did not sleep. He arranged ledgers and checked the satchel twice. He made a notation in a private column, a black dot beside a blank page, and then removed his spectacles to rub the bridge of his nose. For a moment Lucian's hands hesitated over the bone-handled stamp. He had paused earlier when he found the marginalia. That pause had mattered. It had introduced doubt into his rigid procedure. Mareth passed him the keyring and asked, "Did you close it properly?" Lucian's reply was curt. "I closed it," he said, His voice had the flatness of a man who had learned to bury a startle. An unexpected twist arrived when Lucian found a partial remark hidden in a ledger margin. A name not wholly erased but overwritten with a bureaucratic notation that implied a different office had handled the erasure months earlier. Lucian's reaction was an inward stutter, a sharp lift of the eyebrow, a pause long enough to be visible. He shared this with Mareth in a low voice. Someone tried to overwrite this before. Lucian, the work came from a different hand. Mareth stared into the candle flame and replied, "Then the order is older than we thought." The revelation changed the stakes. It moved the error or the crime from the two men acting alone to an institutional process that reached upward. The change in understanding shifted fear into wary calculation. No, 47 felt the shift too, but he could not know the ledger detail. He felt it through a small change in the guard's behavior. Mareth moved with more care, and Lucian's motions gained an edge of secrecy. No. 47's breath shortened and he sat back on his heels. He had expected to be erased by two hands. Now he understood that erasure was a system. His plan to keep a scrap was now insufficient unless he turned that scrap into something no ledger could consume. Over the next hours, the men performed their duties with synchronized indifference. Lucian sealed a ledger and slid it into the satchel. Mareth polished keys with a rag and stood at the cell door plotting the next round of checks. No. 47 used the daylight that crept through the slit in the cell to press the carved notch deeper. He worked in small movements to avoid notice when the guard's rounds passed by. He invented small rhythms, counting breaths when awake, tracing the margins of his imagined lists with a fingertip when thinking. Each tiny habit aimed to preserve his reality. He moved from raw defiance into a steady smallness. Several events happened in quick succession. First, a messenger came and left, dropping an unmarked envelope on Lucian's desk and taking nothing in exchange. Lucian slit the envelope and read a single line typed on thin paper. "Proceed as scheduled." He passed the paper to Mareth without comment. Second, a clerk from an adjoining office demanded a ledger and carried it away under pretense of cross-checking. The ledger did not return that night. Third, while Mareth paced near the brazier, a rivulet of oil from a gutter fell through a crack and hissed as it struck the coals, throwing a brief flare into Lucian's face. Each external event pushed the story forward and kept tension rising. No. 47 kept his carved notch secret and practiced the shapes of names on the inner cuff of his sleeve. He traced the letters with a fingertip until he could reproduce them in his head with the same clarity as an actual list. He spoke names softly into the darkness as if reciting census numbers. He tested the memory of dates. The work kept him steady. At dawn, Lucian closed the final ledger and tapped his brass seal twice before packing the satchel. Mareth clicked the keys into his pocket and cast one look at the slit of light through the cell. "We are clean here." Lucian folded his hands and did not answer. No, 47 watched Lucian lower his spectacles and felt a brittle acceptance. He had survived the burning, and he had left a notch in stone. The ledger showed a blank where his name had been, and the brass seal marked the record as complete. The chapter ends with a final, unmistakable action. Lucian set the sealed ledger into his satchel, tapped the seal twice, closed the satchel, and shifted it onto his shoulder. Mareth fastened the cell door and slid the heavy iron bolt. No, 47 touched the carved notch with a fingertip and felt the splintered wood still lodged under his nail. Lucian took 2 steps into the corridor and the satchel swung against his hip. Mareth turned the ring of keys once in his palm like a metronome. The ledger was closed. The scrap was ash. The notch remained. The corridor swallowed the sound of Lucian's boots as he walked away. Mareth shoved the sealed bundle into the brazier and the embers flared against the damp leather binding. Suspicion tightened Lucian Merrick's jaw as he watched the paper curl and blacken. He kept stamping index cards because he feared a ledger that did not behave exactly as ordered. Mareth did not look at the flames. He kept his eyes on the prisoner's cell line running in Lucian's mind, the evidence of names that could ripple into questions. The brazier hissed. Lucian tapped the brass seal twice and dropped a card into the ash pan. The central problem stood raw in those first moments. Registry entries matched the state's story, and a mismatch could cost men their lives. That is what Lucian understood, and that is why he had come to the vault at midnight with Mareth at his shoulder. Stamp it clean, Mareth, no loose threads. Lucian answered with the mechanical motion of a man who had removed feeling from ritual. He set the stamp pressed, and the mark sank into damp paper. 2 wardens had cleared the corridor. The brazier's heat picked up the smell of wet ink and charred glue. A junior clerk held a charred fragment in trembling fingers by the doorway. The clerk's lips were white. "Lucian," the clerk said, and his voice broke on the name. Lucian took the piece without touching it. He read the margin at the edge of the burn, the bent cipher he had learned to recognize. The cipher sketched a name tied to a patron whose reach reached farther than most of the pens and seals in the archive. Mareth watched Lucian's fingers. Lucian's hand stopped over the brazier for a fraction of a second. His face did not show fear, it showed calculation. Suspicion became calculation, and the calculation curved toward a question. Who else knew, and who would suffer if the ledger kept breathing? They had begun this ritual because of the damp slip shoved under the corridor lamp the week before. The same slip No. 47 had pressed to his ribs like a talisman. That paper had already been a problem in the office, a small irregularity reported by a porter who could not read ciphers but could fold a scrap all the same. Outside the chamber, a porter had moved with the wrong timing, hands that fumbled the cell keys and left a trace. The trace had come to Lucian in the form of a burned corner and a partial ledger code. Lucian had called Mareth for precision, not pity. "Bring it here," Mareth, tapping the brim of his glove against the brazier rail. They worked like 2 instruments tuned to the same cold tempo. Mareth handled bodies and doors. Lucian handled paper and sequence. When the clerk left, Lucian folded his hands around the last intact index card and read the tiny, precise letters that meant a person had been written down and then excised. The scene shifted to the cell corridor. The porter moved like someone carrying contraband. He slipped a folded ink, smudged scrap through a rusted bar to No. 47 and stepped back before the prisoner could call his name. No. 47 opened the scrap with shaking fingers. The ink had blood where water had touched it. But the cipher was there and the ledger reference matched a number No. 47 had been whispering to himself for months. He pressed the scrap to his palm as if it were a pulse. He counted his breaths aloud, the same rhythm he had used at the grill since he first arrived. Counting held his head steady. Counting kept him from letting the memory flood his voice. That tangible scrap brought a shift in No. 47's mood from resigned endurance to a sudden, taut hope. He whispered the ledger number into the wood of his cot while he traced the folded paper against his sleeve. The next morning, the junior clerk walked into Lucian's office with his cap in both hands and a charred fragment wrapped in oilcloth. He had found it discarded near the brazier, a sliver that matched the porter's scrap when pressed next to it. This was near the brazier, registrar, the clerk said. It had part of a margin on it. Lucian turned the fragment. The cipher sat at the edge, half eaten by flame, Lucian's lips pressed together. He called Mareth silently with a look. When Mareth arrived, he did not ask questions. He watched Lucian as Lucian ran the fragment along the edge of his desk. Their relationship had rules. Lucian supplied the shape of facts. Mareth enforced their silence. Both had found a comfort in that arrangement. The moment the discrepancy registered in Lucian's mind, the tone of his movements changed. He spoke more slowly. "Seal the door, Lucian." Mareth moved to the latch and closed the office to the corridor. He did not wait for permission. The action cut off other clerks from hearing their exchange. The door's iron groan folded into the thicker sound of Lucian sorting pages. Lucian arranged the fragments across the desk, aligning burned edges until the cipher revealed itself clearly. He tapped the brass seal twice. The ritualistic motion hit his hands. "Tremor, this margin is wrong, Lucian, wrong in a way that points to a patron." Mareth's posture changed. He leaned in close to see the cipher. "Patron names make trouble. Mareth, you know the rule." Lucian. Dialogue moved the room. They traded short lines that made the stakes explicit. Lucian. "Mareth, if this reaches a patron, what does it cost?" "People," Lucian replied. "People cost more than stamps." Mareth's jaw tightened. He counted with knuckles on the desk and then straightened. The room smelled of smoked paper and Lucian's inked fingers. They decided to fetch No. 47 and bring him into the registry. That was the first pivot from passive record, keeping to active confrontation. It turned a missing line on a page into a living body who could confirm or deny an entry. Mareth returned to the cell block with the same hands that had closed the office door. He moved through the corridor without haste. His boots did not echo. He dragged No. 47 out of his cot by the collar and led him toward the registrar's chamber. No. 47 kept counting breaths until the metal door slammed behind them. He counted until the counting matched the rhythm of Mareth's feet. He stopped only when Mareth forced his sleeves up and demanded to see every crease. Mareth forced movement with a flat voice that did not invite conversation. Hands out, Mareth ordered. No. 47 held out his arms. Lucian watched the ink stains on No. 47's sleeve and the faint crease where a scrap had been hidden. He questions like a man cataloguing evidence. Where did you get that scrap? Lucian. A porter. No. 47 said he wouldn't look. Mareth cut him off with a short word. He was not interested in speeches. He was interested in whether No. 47 had a mark on his skin, a ledger sign, a seal, anything that proved he had been logged. No. 47 pushed his sleeve up. A small rectangular scar showed where a paper had once been pressed against his arm. He had carved a series of tiny tallies into the wood of his cot. Now his skin bore a faint, inked smudge. Lucian's breath was measured. He touched the smudge without hesitating and traced the pattern. Recognition tightened his face. The smudge matched the cipher on the charred fragment. Lucian. Mareth, what do you see? Lucian did not answer immediately. He felt a shift in the room's gravity. Suspicion had moved, and now calculation slid toward danger. His fingers brushed the scrap in No. 47's sleeve and then withdrew. This ties to a patron. Lucian finally. It ties up the ledger in a way that someone above will notice. The moment bore the first emotion shift. Suspicion turned into fear for the ledger's consequences, and then into a practical coldness that planned removal. Mareth barked a brief laugh. Remove him, he said, but Lucian's eyes did not leave the smudge. He thought of the brazier and the stamp and how one name could unravel the neat order of the registry. No. 47 reached for the scrap in his sleeve in a movement that surprised Mareth. He lunged at the edge of Lucian's desk, fingers scraping for any ledger that still had the mark. Stop him. Mareth snapped. Mareth's hands were on No. 47 before the prisoner finished the reach. He bent the prisoner's arm back, fingers finding the joint and holding with mechanical strength. No. 47's shoulders struggled, nails pressing into Mareth's palm. The registrar pushed his chair back, his body moving with a new urgency. Lucian. Now, Mareth. Lucian's hands were not steady, but they were decisive. He seized the final marked page from the ledger and set it on the desk between the brazier and his palm. The light from the brazier made the ink shine wetly. For a beat the room held. No. 47's chest heaved. Mareth's grip tightened along the prisoner's wrist. Lucian lifted the page with fingers that betrayed the slightest shake. Please, No. 47 said. Not a plea, but a small sound pulled from the back of his throat. Lucian did not meet the prisoner's eyes. He held the page over the flame, then pushed it down. The ink blackened, and the paper curled inward. No. 47 lunged forward, palms scraping the wood, and Mareth's elbow caught him mid-motion. The blaze took the mark in a small, vicious flip. The page turned to ash in seconds, and the brazier swallowed it. Lucian felt a sudden collapse in his chest at the point where a conscience might have been. He did not allow himself to name it. That moment was the chapter's climax. It was violent in a bureaucratic way. Official action rendered a life invisible. No. 47 beat his palms on the desk until Mareth forced him back. He had tried to save the page with a raw animal motion that made the room taste like metal. When the flames died, Lucian stooped and, in the darkness beneath the desk, retrieved a tiny folded scrap he had not meant to keep. It was warm from the brazier's heat. He slipped it into his coat without looking up. The room shifted again. The registrar who had burned a name now kept a private remnant of that same name in his pocket. There was no speech for that contradiction. Only a small private action that contradicted the public ritual. No. 47 returned to his cot with his palms raw from the scrape and his hands stained with ash. He carved another mark into the wood with the blunt edge of a spoon. The tali was fresh and deliberate, a physical assertion that he had been there. In the dawn hush, Lucian sat with the scrap pressed to his chest beneath his coat. He held the folded paper and counted his breaths, the same way No. 47 had counted at the grill. His hands did not tremble outwardly, but the paper warmed his palm as if it were a pulse. That private preservation changed the way Lucian had to move through the registry. He had executed the erasure publicly and nurtured an evidence piece privately. The choice set him on a path that would tie him to the prisoner in ways he could not yet name. Outside, the corridor lights burned low. A junior clerk walked past Lucian's office and paused at the open doorway, then went on. Lucian did not stand. He kept the scrap in his pocket like contraband. The chapter closed on a concrete action. Lucian rose, smoothed his coat, and locked the outer drawer where the ledger once had been. The drawer had an empty slot where a name used to sit. He closed it and then put the tiny scrap back in the pocket nearest his heart. A soft knock came at the registrar's outer door, measured and deliberate. Lucian's hand found the brass knob. He slid the folded scrap deeper into his lining, felt the warmth disappear, and opened the door. The man standing there was not new, but his expression shifted the immediate stakes. The porter who had slipped the scrap now stood with his head bent, eyes avoiding Lucian. "Registrar," the porter said, voice small enough to be private. "Someone about no. 47 this morning. They want the ledger closed properly." Lucian's mouth made a thin line. He took a breath and measured the next move. "Bring me their name." The porter hesitated, then spoke the name. Lucian wrote it on a fresh card and did not stamp it. He folded the card and slid it into his inner coat pocket, next to the scrap. The chapter ends on that concrete decision. Lucian keeps a private record folded against his chest, and the registrar's office keeps its gap, while a knock at the door insists the ledger will not stay quiet. The fire has done its work, but the smolder of the hidden scrap carries a memory that may yet burn others. Lucian lifted the bone-handled stamp, and the metal ring on its face caught the candle. A suspicion sat like grit behind his ribs. It pushed his hands to tremble once before he controlled them. "Make it clean, Mareth," and the word fell flat on the table. Lucian brought the stamp down with deliberate force, and heard the biscuit sound of metal searing paper. He tasted iron when he breathed, and thought of the damp slip shoved under the corridor lamp weeks earlier, when Mareth had shoved it at the door. The conflict was simple and absolute. A man had to be removed from every book. Lucian's background never allowed for spectacle. He had learned ledger law in a half-lit office, practiced precise strokes until ink flowed obediently under his quill. He thought in columns and margins. Tonight, those skills carried weight beyond neatness. They now balanced consequence. He kept his spectacles, the brass seal, the habit of tapping the seal twice before stamping. Those small rituals steadied him while Mareth waited with the brazier's dull warmth breathing up from the alcove. Mareth pushed the cell door open and forced No. 47 forward. Lucian watched the prisoner as Mareth dragged him into the archive chamber. The man's hands clutched the sleeve where Lucian knew a scrap might be hidden. Lucian saw the faint crease at the cuff, the thumb rubbing a seam. No. 47's mouth moved while he counted breaths. The counting was a noise Lucian could place now. 3 counts, then a pause, an attempt to anchor the self. The registrar noticed the ink smudge that peaked at the cuff seam like a secret label. Lucian, Mareth, and the name was not an address so much as a command. "Quick. Verify." Mareth's voice carried a controlled impatience. He did not look at the ledger that had sat open on the desk. He set a sealed directive on the wood with palms flat, the wax shining like a wound. Lucian saw the edge of a stamped insignia through the crease of the wax and understood the scale of the order. Suspicion turned into calculation in Lucian's mind. He pretended to consult the ledgers while his fingers searched for a plausible place to stamp. His action was slow enough to read as ritual. His eyes moved across brittle paper, past tabs and numbers, but his glance kept returning to the cuff and the faint scrap he had glimpsed. He needed to appear mechanical, devoted to the job. Maintaining obedience would protect him. Yet the scrap mattered. A clerk's forgotten notation could undo the clean line the directive insisted upon. The problem was concrete. If the scrap showed No. 47 had been recorded once, the order to make him vanish would force a harder erasure. The stakes were not theory, they were a man's presence or absence. Lucian cleared his throat. "State the file number," he said. His voice was flat and small. Mareth named it without hesitation. Lucian looked and did the motions. He tapped the brass seal twice, then 3 times out of habit, and pressed the stamp to the blank warrant. The sound of the stamp closing the page came like a lock. For a moment, Lucian felt both the weight of the stamp and the weight of the room. Brenning light, the brazier's heat, Mareth's shoulders like a bully's silhouette. No. 47's eyes tracked the movement. He pressed his forehead to the iron grill of the small window in his cell when they had taken him out earlier and had watched Hans decide his fate. Lucian remembered that sight, and it slowed his fingers. He had watched 47 count breaths. He had watched Mareth shove a damp slip under a corridor lamp in Chapter 1 and later throw the sealed bundle into a brazier in Chapter 2. Those events had left ash on people's shoes and questions lodged in Lucian's mind. He had arranged index cards after that incident, stamping them to make the books behave, but the books had not forgiven him for looking. Mareth's impatience became action. He barked an order and 47 stumbled forward to be searched for contraband. The interrogator's hands were efficient, sweeping the prisoner's sleeves, checking straps, tugging at hidden pockets. 47 winced when Mareth pressed hard along the seam of the cuff. Lucian saw the moment the prisoner's fingers forced something forward. A smudged scrap the size of a matchbook page. He felt hope like a physical thing, tightening his jaw, making his pulse spike. Lucian picked the scrap up with careful reluctance and flattened it on the desk. The paper bore a faint indent, an index clerk's shorten pressed too hard, or a name rubbed until grit filled the strokes. Lucian leaned close and read the faint letters. A number, a date, and almost erased handwriting that matched a record he half remembered in a margin. The discovery made the room sharper. Lucian's hands betrayed a tremor. He placed the scrap behind his spectacles to study, then drew back as Mareth slammed a sealed directive on the wood. This order is absolute. Mareth, you know the terms, Lucian. He tapped the wax with a knuckle and did not meet Lucian's eyes. His boots brushed the brazier's edge. The flame licked the old leather bindings stacked nearby. You stamp, you arrange, you destroy. The sentence was a sequence of duties, a mechanical law. Lucian's suspicion shifted. It became a precise worry about cost and consequence. He had options that fit within his rituals. Complete perfectly and preserve his role, delay and risk Mareth's suspicion, or do something reckless. He felt the shift as tightness in his throat and a squeeze at the diaphragm. He kept his speech measured. Mareth, Lucian, and he let a pause hold weight. There are indentations here. A prior clerk's notation. I must account. He stopped. The room inhaled. Mareth let a corner of a mouth thin account for what Lucian. That a man breathed. That ledgers remember things that shouldn't be remembered. We account for nothing when the order forbids it. He leaned close and lowered his voice. You stamp, or you watch what happens to the books you love. The threat was not loud. It required no flourish. They began a short duel of motions. Lucian shuffled papers, arranged index cards, kept his hands occupied. This was action. It disguised intent. 47 watched with a brittle hope. He mouthed words without sound and tried to make his fingers steady. Lucian noticed the ink scrap folded twice in the prisoner's sleeve and counted the folds with his eyes. He thought of the small string bracelet tied at 47's wrist and how the prisoner had used it to mark a day. Those small details mattered now. Lucian made a choice that would change the ledger's face. He flipped a small secondary slip from beneath his blotter and palmed it. The motion was slight. His ritualized stamping continued. He stamped 3 index cards to satisfy procedure. He tapped the brass seal twice, then slid the blank warrant toward Mareth with a composed air. Mareth stamped it with a bone-handled stamp of his own and thrust it near the brazier as if to feed it. Hope arrived as a quiet thing. Lucian tucked the tiny preserved notation, no bigger than a fingernail, inside the prisoner's cuff while Mareth's back faced the desk. The act was precise. Lucian used the exact ritual of folding he'd learned as a boy to hide ledger tabs. 47 felt the slip as a foreign press against his skin and his lips shaped. Thank you, though he did not speak the words aloud. The gratitude was a sound locked behind clenched teeth. Lucian tried to remain impassive. He arranged a few more cards to keep Mareth believing in the process. He watched Mareth's shoulders, the way the interrogator counted on his knuckles when he considered something. Mareth moved like a predator that preferred certainty. He did not trust quiet actions or small kindness. Lucian knew that he had seen Mareth throw a sealed bundle into a brazier before and not look back. That memory sought Lucian's temporary relief. Then Mareth produced the sealed directive's companion, an authority stamp with an emblem Lucian had seen on official orders. The interrogator slammed it onto the desk and looked up. You think there's room for mercy in these halls, Lucian? Mareth, you think a clerk can rewrite law? He ran a calloused finger along the wax line. Lucian answered with another small gesture. He acted to finish the ritual. He pressed the brass seal to the open warrant and forced the motion of finishing his duty. The brazier's dull heat crept closer when Mereth pushed a stack of papers toward the fire. Lucian kept his hands steady and his face flat. He had given no. 47 The micro slip. He had made his choice and now he could only hope it would remain hidden. Mereth noticed a small shift in Lucian's breathing. He stepped forward, close enough that Lucian felt the interrogator's breath cool against his ear. What did you hide, Lucian? Mereth? His voice narrowed. Lucian's hope faltered into fear. He had intended to trade a small risk for a small proof of life. Now Mereth's proximity made that calculus dangerous. Lucian felt sweat bead at the temples, and the old ledger laws feel dangerously inadequate to measure the heat of a human life. He could not speak his real thought. That the world of columns and signatures had never carried the weight of an actual man before. Mereth reached for the prisoner's sleeve. His hand closed on fabric and found the folded scrap. He ripped it out. The room reacted. The brazier's light threw the scrap into relief. Mereth's eyes found the fingernail, sized notation at once. Lucian watched Mereth's mouth harden and his fingers go for the sealed order. A new resolve took Mereth's face, a will to obliterate whatever contradicted his authority. A struggle began with the suddenness of a thrown stove lid. Lucian lunged to take the slip, prise it back into the safety of the desk, but Mereth's larger hand was quicker. They grappled over paper and wax. The brazier was between them, and the heat of the flame made their hands move with extra caution. One false motion, and the scrap would fall into fire. Sirens of fear threaded Lucian's thinking. His adrenaline made him clumsy. Papers scattered. The sealed directive slid free of the desk, and its wax seal cracked at the edge. Lucian's fear sharpened. He saw Mereth's jaw set and the interrogator's arm arc to snatch both the slip and the sealed order. Lucian reacted with a small, brutal clarity. He shoved his shoulder into Mereth and reached with both hands. No. 47 saw the movement and pushed to the cramped body of a man who had been practiced in small resistances. Lucian's fingers closed on the slip, Mereth's on the wax. The two objects tumbled up and spun toward the brazier. For a single moment everything was a study in trajectory and heat. The slip, the sealed directive, a half-dozen pages, metallic glare, wick shadows fell into the brazier. Flame took the paper in a single breath. Lucian felt the loss as a physical blow. The room smelled of burned glue and ink. Mereth cursed and hauled the prisoner back by the collar. After the ember flare, Mereth reasserted control with practiced brutality. He shoved No. 47 toward the cell's back. Mereth, back and stay silent. He did not look at Lucian while he spoke. The interrogator's voice was procedural and full of finality. Lucian felt the world constrict to the sound of pages settling on the desk. He sank into the same ritual of arranging empty papers, as if that could reorder consequence. Lucian's fear shifted into a quiet, persistent shame. He had come away with nothing visible. The items that proved the prisoner's existence had been consumed. Yet he had managed one last small subversion, a microscopic fingernail-sized mark hidden beneath the rim of an old ledger's underside. He had made the mark with the exact pressure of a quill. It was a thing that would not show to cursory inspection, and would require a finger to find it. It would not live in printed index or public roll, but it would be proof. In the narrow cell later, No. 47 pressed his fingertip against a folded sleeve and found the hidden slip Lucian had placed there. He set his hand beneath the single guttering candle and traced the tiny indent Lucian had made on the ledger's underside, feeling the shallow ridge through paper and skin. The evidence was tactile. It required faith in touch and memory. No. 47 pressed until his knuckle whitened. Lucian watched him from the archive shelf. When he returned to sundry tasks, he arranged ledgers and pretended to be immersed in work. His hands moved with old competence. The registrar's motions were acts of concealment as much as duty. He touched the ledger where the mark hid and did not make a show of the action. His heartbeat had slowed but not settled. A fresh shift in Lucian's emotions occurred, from shame into a restrained resolve. He no longer simply acted to preserve his job. He now acted to preserve a human trace. He would not make a public record of it. He would risk a quiet, constant smallness, microscopic marks, hidden folds, a system of tiny proofs, so the man might exist off the books. This new resolve carried cost. If discovered, Lucian would lose position, possibly more. He accepted the risk with the same clean calculation he used for seal weights and ink dippings. No. 47's presence in the cell remained unchanged in official terms. The record would show an absence, yet the prisoner had proof under his thumb. He pressed the micro mark again, feeling the paper ridges catch his skin. He kept his breaths counted and steady. The count continued to be a method for surviving the slow hours. Mareth delivered orders that morning. Stricter watch, fewer visitors, a notation in the register that the file was complete. He spoke to Lucian once near the brazier's cold edge. "Do not make mistakes, Lucian," he said. Lucian answered by arranging an index card and tapping the brass seal twice. The exchange was spare but heavy. It left no room for sentiment. Lucian's mind returned to the scenes of the burnt ledgers. He remembered Mareth's brazier in Chapter 2, and the way the embers had flared against leather. He thought of the damp slip shoved under a corridor lamp in Chapter 1 and the way that single dampness had set others in motion. Those memories now shaped his decisions. He kept the mark masked beneath the ledger and practiced finding it with one hand while arranging other papers with the other. Later that dawn, someone new arrived at the archive, a junior clerk who had worked beside Lucian for years. He came to fetch a file and froze when Lucian's fingers brushed against the ledger's underside. He did not ask questions. He simply nodded to Lucian and adjusted a stack of cards. The junior clerk's quiet confirmation was another small external event that shifted risk. Someone else had noticed the ledger's subtle irregularity.